Hi, welcome to the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Library and Museums. My name's Kevin Moore. I'm the curator of artifacts here. And what that means is I get to handle our 20,000 plus artifacts, and I play a lead role in designing our rotating exhibits. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to take you through our newest rotating exhibit, which just opened. It's called Resolute, The Spirit of Arctic Exploration. And what this exhibit is about is humanity's efforts to explore the polar regions of our planet. So come along with me and check it out. So the first thing that we talk about in our exhibit is the people who call this part of the world home. Typically, our exhibits dealing with President Hayes and his era, we tend to focus in the 19th century for the most part. This is something new for us. We go way back in time and begin looking at the Neolithic period. Ancient cultures like the Thule culture or the Dorset culture, who will eventually become the Inuit who inhabit the Arctic, Canadian Arctic today. So we talk a little bit about the people that call this part of the world home, but much of our exhibit deals with Arctic exploration. People who've tried to map and discover this area, coming from Europe, coming from the United States. So take a look at this. This is a map that we have. This is the first known map of the Arctic, the first attempt to map the Arctic. This was produced by a cartographer named Gerardus Mercator. If you've ever seen rectangular map that flares out at the polar regions, but in the equator everything is to scale, those were created by Mercator. They're known as Mercator maps, and they provided a good tool for navigators to traverse the globe. Well, he attempted to do the same type of map, but for the Arctic. And so you see the Arctic as the focus, and then as you get closer to the equator, everything flares out and gets distorted. But what's interesting is when he produced this in 1607, nobody really had much of a clue of what the Arctic looked like. So he has a few large islands or small continents up there. He thought that they might be inhabited. He's got at the very North Pole, he has a large black mountain that was believed to be a magnetic mountain, which is what causes all compasses to point to the North Pole. And most of this is produced just based on some travel logs out of the Middle Ages that are embellished and not particularly accurate. But this is Europe's first attempt to try to map the Arctic. So that's our starting point. And as we go along, efforts to explore the Arctic are only going to get better. So if you come this way, if you get the chance to visit our exhibit in person, which I highly encourage you to do, there's a lot more that we can't share in a brief 10-minute video. But if you get the chance to visit here, you can sit down at a desk and kind of go through an exercise that a lot of Arctic explorers would have to go through, and that is create your own Arctic expedition. So you sit down with paper, pencil, and a chart, these dividers and triangles, and you can map out your trip through the Arctic. But one thing you're prompted to do is to think about, okay, how long are you going to be at sea? You need to factor all kinds of things, like the sea is not going to be melted and traversable for most of your trip. The Arctic for much of the year freezes over, so your ship is going to become beset, as they called it, or encased in ice. So you need to pack enough provisions so that your crew can survive a long and rough winter. And that winter could be fairly short, or it could go well into June the following year, so you have to plan for that. Another thing that Arctic explorers would have to prepare for is the problem of scurvy, which is an illness that would befall sailors due to a lack of vitamin C in their diet. And so to combat this, crews would stock gallons and gallons of lime juice to try to prevent that. So this exercise invites you to try to figure out for your crew of 100 sailors, just how much supplies are you going to have to bring and prepare for. So if you come around this way into the core of our exhibit, we talk a little bit more about the Inuit, who play a recurring role throughout this history. Often the Inuit are mistreated by explorers, but also the Inuit play a helping hand. Often as European and American explorers find themselves shipwrecked or stranded in the Arctic, it's the Inuit who know how to live in this environment who have to come and help them. So we have a couple things on display. We talk about Inuit artwork. We have a piece here that comes from President Hayes's collection. That is a necklace that was given to President Hayes. It's made from the teeth of walrus. And then we have a couple more contemporary pieces of stonework. As the Inuit became more integrated into Canadian society in the 1900s, Inuit artwork was promoted as a way for these more impoverished provinces in northern Canada to help bring in some revenue. And so Inuit artwork over the last 50, 60, 70 years has become quite prized in the art collecting community. So we talk about that and we display some examples of Inuit artwork. As we talk about the main issue of our exhibit, which is exploring the Arctic, much of that revolves around this idea of a Northwest Passage. And that is a route that you can take through the Arctic, through the Canadian archipelago, through these little islands and waterways, above northern Alaska, and then into the Pacific Ocean. The thinking among Europeans was, well, if we can navigate the Arctic, we can cut the travel time to trade with China and Japan and India, instead of going the long way around Africa and through the Indian Ocean. There were dozens and dozens of attempts to try to figure out the route to get through here. And this concept of a Northwest Passage plays very prominently throughout this history. So some of the earliest expeditions, we talk about the Vikings and their early settlement of the Arctic. We talk about the first English to arrive, John Cabot, Henry Hudson. We talk about the Russians who attempted to explore the Arctic, but from the Pacific side. They tried to explore the Northwest Passage coming from Alaska and essentially working backwards. We talk about the voyages of the famous explorer James Cook, who's best known for his expeditions around Hawaii, his efforts to explore the Arctic. And then some famous British expeditions led by John Ross and William Parry, who will map out the Canadian archipelago. The reason we look at a lot of this stuff, what does any of this have to do with President Hayes? Well, it appears that President Hayes had a big time interest in the Arctic. We have a number of books on display from his personal library. He had a personal collection of books of about 12,000 volumes. He read all sorts of things, but he's got a number of books related to Arctic exploration. So that indicates to us that he at least had some kind of interest in the subject. Some of them are from John Franklin, who is perhaps the most famous Arctic explorer. Some of them are more contemporary to his time when he's president. The American voyages of Charles Hall, for instance. So it seems that Hayes has a bit of an interest in the Arctic, and that's not at all uncommon for people in this period. The Arctic was the final frontier of its day. Most of the continents had been explored, and the last unknown is the poles. And so kind of the same way that we really tend to have an interest as a society in space exploration. We get really excited with everything that SpaceX is doing. We are fascinated by the pictures coming out of the James Webb Space Telescope. Space is our final frontier, but in the 19th century, that level of interest is kind of what the Arctic presented to people living at that time. We talk quite a bit about what becomes known as the Lost Franklin Expedition. This is probably the most famous expedition of the Arctic. It was also the most equipped. John Franklin was a seasoned naval officer, and he goes to the Arctic with 2 refitted warships called Erebus and Terror. He's got 130 crewmen, and this is the best equipped effort Europe has ever sent to the Arctic. The ships, the hulls are reinforced. They've got steam-powered furnaces to keep them warm. They've got enough food to last them 2 years, 3 to 4 if they stretch things out. So everyone's kind of betting that this is going to be a successful expedition. Well, a couple of years later, it becomes evident that something has gone terribly wrong. And there's several efforts to go and figure out what happened to the Franklin expedition, possibly to rescue them if they're stranded in the Arctic. But as it becomes apparent that they probably didn't survive, there's more expeditions to just solve the mystery. This becomes the greatest unsolved mystery of the 1800s. Whatever happened to John Franklin and his crew? And this mystery plays a direct role into something related to the Hayes presidency. One of those expeditions to try and figure out what happened is the Resolute. The HMS Resolute was a ship that headed to the Arctic in 1852 to try to find the Franklin expedition. This ship also gets stuck in the ice. The crew has to abandon ship. They walk on overland on the ice to go get rescued, and they just leave the ship. When the ice melted the following summer, the Resolute drifted all on its own to the Atlantic Ocean, where it was picked up by some whaling ships. That ship was sold to Congress. They patched it up and they sent it back to England as a gift. Queen Victoria herself received it. And then a couple decades later, they decommissioned the Resolute, and they had the timbers of that ship turned into some desks. So when President Hayes is president, one day at the White House, this crate arrives, this gigantic crate that's got no name. It wasn't expected. And so President Hayes' secretary signs for it, calls the president down. They get a crowbar, they crack open this crate, and inside they see this beautiful, ornately carved desk with a plaque on it that explains that this desk was made from the timbers of the Resolute, and it is a gift between our 2 nations showing our friendship. That desk will be available to almost every president since Hayes, and since Bill Clinton's administration, the Resolute desk has occupied the Oval Office. And so we have a picture here, kind of interesting picture here of the Resolute desk. It was briefly on display in the Smithsonian. And here's a picture of President Hayes' great-grandson visiting the desk while it was in the Smithsonian. That was an interesting discovery that we found in the archives of the Smithsonian. So that's kind of cool that our president is the president who receives the Resolute desk, since that desk has become synonymous with the Oval Office and all of the prestige and stability that represents. We also, in our exhibit, we talk about a couple expeditions that occur during Hayes' political career and his presidency. We talk about one led by Charles F. Hull. That was when the United States tried to become the first to reach the North Pole. That expedition falls apart. The captain, Hull, he ends up getting murdered while he's up there. The ship gets shipwrecked on the way back. There's a congressional investigation to figure out what went wrong. And another expedition that occurs during Hayes' presidency is led by a man named Henry Howgate. He's one of the investigators in the Hull expedition to figure out what happened to it. But he was a proponent of what was called polar colonization. He wanted to set up a permanent research base up in the Arctic to monitor the weather and to study it scientifically. He solicited private donations all over Washington. He tried to get Congress to pass a law to fund it. and he solicited support for his legislation. We even have on display some correspondence from Howgate to President Hayes asking him to support his law. We have a copy of a book that he wrote on polar colonization. You'll see in the right-hand corner there, it says Compliments of H.W. Howgate. And so he tried to get Hayes's support for this expedition. That bill will fail in Congress a number of times, but eventually in a modified form, it will end up getting passed, and Hayes will sign it into law. That expedition doesn't fare too well either, but when Howgate comes back, it becomes discovered that through all of his fundraising and so forth, he had been engaged in quite a bit of fraud and illegal activity. He ends up getting indicted for embezzling over $100,000 from the US government, which in the 1880s is a lot of money. And then amid all these stories of failure to discover the Northwest Passage, eventually somebody's finally able to do it. His name is Roald Amundsen. He's a Norwegian, and he successfully completes a journey through the Northwest Passage in 1905. He's able to do it with a much smaller ship. He's only got a crew of about 7 people. He's using a ship called the Joa, which is only slightly bigger than a sailboat. And he's able to successfully do it. And what we have on display is a beautiful model of the Joa. This comes from a shipbuilding group, particularly a man named Ray Peacock from Ontario, Canada, who was nice enough to loan this to us. And this ship isn't made out of a box kit or anything like that. This is a handmade model that someone produced by looking at pictures of the ship, looking at schematics of the ship, and designing their own to-scale model. So it's a very beautiful model of the first ship to make it through the Northwest Passage. And then we conclude our exhibit by looking at the Arctic since President Hayes's day, bringing it all the way up to today. We talk about the role the Arctic played in both world wars, how it became a front during the Cold War, and then we talk about what a melting Arctic has meant. The fact that the Arctic is losing its sea ice plays an important role in geopolitics. It plays a role in economics. For example, with less and less ice in the Arctic, shipping companies are wanting to run super freighters through it. These are freighters that carry so much cargo they're too big to fit through the Panama Canal. And so they want to run them through the Arctic, where previously that would have been impossible. And this creates all kinds of issues like who owns those waters, who can pass through them, are they creating further environmental damage by running such large ships through that part of the ocean. And so these are some interesting conversations that we have to deal with in our time that deals with more current Arctic history. And so that kind of concludes my walkthrough of our Arctic exhibit. I encourage you, if you are traveling through this part of the country, through Northwest Ohio, I encourage you to stop by, check out the home of our 19th president, and then learn a little bit about the Arctic while you're here. So thank you very much for joining me.